And now, please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Welcome to that great day in the Christian calendar, a celebratory day, the Sunday after Easter. This has, for obvious reasons, as we look around, been known as Low Sunday. I would also call it Hardcore Sunday, because this is a day when the hardcore people show up. You should pat yourselves on the back for being here. Last Sunday, people got chocolates for Easter, but part of me thinks that we should be giving out chocolates to those of you who show up today. You deserve your gold star. But there's this phenomenon that, after some great high, after some great accomplishment, there's the inevitable letdown. You know what I mean. Maybe you're a big Bruins fan. You've been watching their record-setting season. You're so excited for the playoffs. But surely in a few weeks, it'll all be over, and you can put that black and gold away for another year. We've all had that experience where you have some great achievement, and then reality sets in. You start a new company, let's say, and you make your first big sale. Then you have to deliver the goods, and so you start to sweat a bit. Or your kid gets into college. You couldn't be happier for her. Then you have to find a way to write that tuition check and buy all the stuff for the dorm room. Isn't it wonderful, Mom and Dad? I got into college. Yes, dear, wonderful, you respond, as your mind is racing about what it will mean to you, especially to see your loved one go off to college. But particularly when we start talking about the spiritual side of life, we have to wrestle with what we do when those resurrection moments recede. Last Sunday, I preached about how important those resurrection moments are for our lives. They change our life and give us hope when before we saw nothing but dead ends. Resurrection moments are crucial for us as Christians. But what do we do when the euphoria of those moments wears off? That really is the key question. How do we sustain a rich spiritual life outside of or after some amazing spiritual high? You could make a similar dilemma on a weekly basis. If you're a church dork, as I am, and again, since you're the hardcore ones, I assume you are too, you love Sunday worship. It boosts you up and grounds you in God's presence. Then you wake up on Monday morning and wonder what to do about your spiritual life for the week ahead. This is a big deal, a central question. Now, in our text for today, the disciples are huddled together in the upper room on Easter evening. The doors were locked, and the room smelled of smoke from cheap oil lamps and human sweat. They had heard the amazing report that morning from Mary Magdalene about meeting the risen Christ. Could it be true? What does this mean? Then, as hour after hour passes, the fear sets in. The tomb was empty. Surely the authorities would come looking for them to find out what the disciples had done with Jesus' body. The last thing the authorities want is to make a martyr out of Jesus. Somehow, perhaps Jesus really was raised from the dead. But that doesn't change the reality of their lives, of their fear and uncertainty of what to do. Some of the disciples were pacing back and forth. Others just sat and stared out into nothing. Now what? How are we supposed to be disciples in a post-resurrection world? As I mentioned several weeks ago, yay, more theology. As I mentioned several weeks ago, one of the classic theories of the atonement, that is how we are made right by God, is known as moral atonement. Moral atonement claims that we are made right by God through molding our lives and actions after Jesus. The more and more we become like Jesus, the more sanctified we are. This has been, understandably, the most popular framework for salvation among liberal Christians. What does it mean to be a Christian, to be saved? Follow in the footsteps of Jesus. In the moral atonement theory, the cross takes center stage. We are called to pick up our cross and follow Jesus. As the great hymn tells us, onward Christian soldiers marching as to war with the cross of Jesus going on before. We are to sacrifice ourselves for the sake of the gospel and the building of the kingdom. The Christian life is not all about lilies and joys and celebration. It involves suffering, real suffering, to bring about the world that God wants. The powers of evil are real. we must fight against those powers with all that we have. Moral atonement theory has had a tremendous impact on our society and life as Americans. So many of the great social movements in our country have been driven by Christians who are motivated by just this type of atonement theory. The prison reform movement and the abolition movement of the early 19th century are great examples, as are prohibition, the progressive movement, the civil rights movement, and more recently, the pro-life movement. Christians are willing to suffer, to push, to carry their own crosses in order to bring about a new society. So when we ask what sustains us between those resurrection moments, what leads us on from Sunday to Sunday, one answer is our striving to be like Jesus and our willingness to carry our own cross. As you can imagine, this has a lot of wonderful aspects to it. People strive to make themselves and the world around them better, or at least better as they interpret the Christian message. But it also has some very real negatives as well. For starters, we have to discern what is the Christian way that we're supposed to be emulating. We might celebrate the efforts to end slavery or to make a more racially equal society, but we might cringe at efforts to eliminate access to abortion and reproductive health, or to push end to protections for LGBT Americans. Beyond the difficulty of discerning what we should actually be striving for, this moral atonement theory also leads to a lot of burnt out, miserable, and self-righteous Christians. At its worst, Christians can obsessively focus on one thing, like abortion or restricting LGBT rights, as the one thing that makes you a true Christian, while ignoring so much else. And the burnout aspect is real. Congregational churches are proudly volunteer organizations. We celebrate the fact that the church members, all of you, run this church. But especially in a world of dwindling memberships, this means there is a greater and greater burden on fewer and fewer volunteers. Again and again, churches, and congregational churches in particular, inspire great volunteers and then push them until they simply can't do it anymore. The joy is gone, and volunteers, good volunteers, drift away. They drift away for their own well-being. Moral atonement theory and its underlying logic has had an outsized influence on the so-called Yankee mentality. The great congregational theologian Samuel Hopkins wrote in the late 18th century that we must be willing to be damned for the glory of God. We should have disinterested benevolence. We should strive for God's kingdom without any regard whatsoever for its impact on us. This ethos pervades Yankeedom. We should work, work, work. It's ever onward. Does that sound familiar? The secular world in these parts often doesn't realize how big an influence congregational theology has had on our culture. So what are we to do? How do we sustain ourselves between those great moments of resurrection? Yes, as I mentioned last week, we do need to remind ourselves of those moments. Christians are optimistic people. We do believe that God and the good will win out. But even so, we often find ourselves in the upper room with the disciples. We have the message of resurrection ringing in our heads, but we're also facing the very real and often difficult realities of the world. Frequently, we are over-anxious. We are fearful, and we're not sure what to do. This is one of the things that I find so fascinating about our reading this morning that David just read. When the resurrected Christ appears to the disciples on Easter evening, he does not tell them to pick up their crosses and follow him. He does not say, act like me, persist through the pain. While the disciples are scared and anxious, he stands in the midst of them and says, peace be with you. You can almost sense how shocked the disciples are, both to actually see Jesus and then hear those words. Then Jesus shows them his hands and the wound in his side and says again to them, peace be with you. I know you're afraid. I know you're overcome with the worries of life. But I'm here. Peace be with you. Then he gives them the power to forgive sins, to tell others it's okay. What do we make of this? For starters, it should make us question the primacy of taking up our cross to suffer for Jesus. That's not to say that sacrifice is not a part of the Christian life at all, but it's not what will sustain us. So how do we get a sense of God's peace? How can we be more aware of God's presence all around us? This is the question that faces us on the Sunday after Easter, the Sunday after the great elation of Holy Week. What do we do now? How do we find that peace that passes understanding? One of the most impactful and also challenging spiritual books I've ever read is Anthony de Mello's Awareness. De Mello was a Jesuit priest who lived in India and became a legendary spiritual director and leader. Awareness is the edited transcript of one of his courses on spirituality. De Mello claims that the vast majority of people are not really awake, but spiritually asleep. We go through the motions of life not really aware of the deeper reality of our existence. We assume the truths that society tells us without actually examining whether they're really true. There are endless examples of this. Does what college you get into determine your happiness? Perhaps. We're told that, but is it true? Does it matter how much money you make? Of course it does. But how and why? And then what if things go wrong? How much should we depend on others or give of ourselves to others? Why do you struggle with depression and anxiety? De Mello would very much agree with Thoreau that most people live lives of quiet desperation. Yet even when we are chronically unhappy, do we really want to change? Want to be awake? Real change requires pain, so instead of change, we get stuck in our various ruts. What we want is to carry on what we've always done, but just with the obstacles removed. If only that one person would love me, if only I made a little more money, if only my kid would stop acting up, if only. De Mello claims that the real problem is that we're not awake. We're not truly aware. So what does it mean to be awake? To be awake, according to De Mello, is to see life as it actually is. There are good things in life, and there are bad. But in reality, we can do very little about most of them. The world is what it is. People get worried all the time about things that they cannot control. This is particularly true in our interactions with others. We want to get approval for something else from those around us. We drive ourselves crazy to get that approval, and then when it doesn't happen, we blame that other person. How crazy, says De Mello. You cannot control the reactions of others, so why get so obsessed over it? The same thing holds true for when others get mad at you. So often they're mad at you because you've not done something to make their lives better. You've disappointed them in some way. But according to De Mello, that's on them, not you. They want you to feel bad so that you will make them happy. But according to De Mello, you have no obligation to do so. Probably the most challenging aspect of De Mello's approach is the way in which he frames self-interest. We are all self-interested when we think about it, according to De Mello. We all want ourselves to be happy. How could it be any other way? People are people. Rather than running away from self-interest or claiming it's not there, we should open our eyes and just be aware of it. It's a part of human nature. Are we really surprised that certain news channels twist the facts so they can get people riled up? I mean, they're just trying to boost their ratings. That's not surprising. We shouldn't let it get under our skin. A politician caters to certain interests so he or she can get reelected. Why is that a surprise? A colleague at work does what he can to get a promotion or a bonus. That's just the way people are. To get angry or worked up doesn't solve anything, but it might make you very unhappy. Similarly, De Mello points out how often we cling to labels or put labels on others. That person is a good person, while someone else is bad. In reality, according to De Mello, they're all pursuing what they think makes them happy. They're simply people. That person is a Republican or a Democrat, and we all know what they're like, don't we? Do we? Oh, the French, they're the worst. Replace that with Yankees fan. Now that one might be true, but those people. Do you see what labels do? Prevents you from seeing the person. But also labels, we also make labels for ourselves and our own feelings. We are depressed. We are anxious. We are sad. Sometimes those labels persist and become a part of our identity. Oh, I'm someone who is no good. I'm a bad Christian for whatever reason. I'm always the best in the room. We get attached to these labels, and they shape how we are and how we experience the world. But that has negative consequences. Once we're awake, according to DeMello, we can see the world as it actually is. And once we see the world as it actually is, it has far less power to dictate how we feel. That person did something bad to me. Well, that person was merely being that person. He or she was following his or her self-interest. When I think about it, I have little reason to be mad at that person. I can't control the other person, but I can determine how I react to them. That person is mad at me for not doing this or that. That only has to affect you if you let it. Rather than labeling people as one way or another, we can strive to see them as people, and therefore all as children of God. They might be different from you, but so are their experiences and their lives. Learn to understand them. Be awake. See their motivations, their histories. Rather than labeling yourself as depressed, say that you're currently feeling depression now, and then name those reasons. Seek detachment from your emotions so you can observe them and then understand them. Understanding is the key. What's remarkable about DeMello's approach is that it can be so freeing. We don't have to be captive to our emotions or to what other people do. We can observe the world and draw appropriate boundaries. I don't have to work all the time to make someone else happy. That is them putting that on me. I might choose to do so, but I might choose to push myself to make others happy, but we should be honest that we're choosing it because we want to, because it brings us something as well. For DeMello, this type of detachment is key to compassion. You see, when you see people with new eyes, when you're truly aware of all the dynamics around you, you can appreciate other people as human beings, acting as human beings do. Equally importantly, you can find peace, true peace. According to DeMello, Jesus was awake. He saw the Pharisees for what they were and what they were doing. He knew the dynamics of the religious establishment and both the good and bad that brought with it. He could see people suffering for the labels that others put upon them. You see this all the time in the Gospels. And he cared for them people, not as labels. The prime example of Jesus' detachment was his ability and willingness to go to the cross. He could see life and death for what they were. They were a part of existence. He felt fear and anxiety about his approaching death, but he didn't let that fear and anxiety control him or define him. That, of course, it must be said, is far more detachment than most of us could hope for, but at least shows a new way. On Good Friday, I preached about the cross. Specifically, I preached about how, in the Gospel of John, Jesus and Pontius Pilate are talking on different planes. Pontius Pilate could not understand why Jesus would not run away from the cross at all costs. All Jesus had to do was just play the game, play the system, go along to get along. But Jesus didn't do that. And in response to Pilate, Jesus affirms that there is a deeper reality to the world. Death did not have a hold on him. He was truly free. Free to love, free to live without illusions. We don't need to see the cross as a command to suffer, that we should all be suffering for the kingdom. The cross points out that death and the ways of the world are what they are. They're a part of reality, and they don't have to have the final word. We can be awake, be aware, be free, be at peace. After the encounter in the upper room today, in our reading for today, the disciples don't run away from death. As I said last week, 11 of the 12 disciples ended up dying as martyrs. When they received the Holy Spirit from the risen Christ in our reading for today, they were awake. They were able to see the world anew. They didn't need to blame those who were seeking to arrest them. Of course they were seeking to arrest them. They were doing their jobs. Why be angry at them? Why let doing their jobs keep the disciples in fear and anxiety? The world is as it is. And when you can see the world as it is, then you can see that true happiness, true joy, and true peace can come to us through a sense of detachment. Then they could pursue compassion and justice without being overwhelmed by their emotions. I have a hard time thinking of anything more powerful. Now, it must be said, even though I appreciate DeMello's insights and his interpretation of Jesus, it's not easy. I am someone who was raised as a middle child, which means I am an inherent people pleaser. I'm also someone who's very much a type A person. So much of my self-value over the years has come from accomplishments and ways that I've earned praise for doing things. But especially as I've gotten older, I can sit back and see that all of this is coming with cost. When I disappoint others, it eats me up inside. I simply can't take it. When I don't achieve that goal I value, I can feel worthless or depressed. But it's also because I'm now more aware of these tendencies that I can try to seek after detachment and not let my people-pleasing or my desire for accomplishments always control my emotions. I do want that peace that God can give. Peace in the world is fleeting. The peace that passes understanding, the peace that John the Evangelist and also the Apostle Paul talks about, that peace is real. As we sit here on Low Sunday, the Sunday after all the excitement of Easter, the Sunday when reality sets in, let us think deeply about the nature of peace, true peace. Can we observe the world around us? I mean, truly observe it? Can we see where our emotions are coming from and seek detachment from them? Or at least be aware of where they're coming from? Can we see the world as being what it is and not let that torture us? It's a challenge, no doubt, but I think it's a challenge worth taking seriously. When we close our eyes, we can see ourselves in that upper room. We can feel the risen Christ stand among us. And if we work at it, we can hear those words of Jesus and just let them wash over us. Peace be with you. He says again, peace be with you. Yes, peace indeed.